For years, China has always seen the United States as a country of strength, military dominance, global influence, economic power. But over time, that perception started to change. Because instead of looking at what made America strong, China started looking at what made it dependent. And that's when it found something unexpected, a pattern most people never noticed. It started with something small: rare earth materials. These are the elements behind modern life: phones, electric vehicles, advanced weapons systems. At first, they didn't look important. But China paid attention to something others didn't: who processes them at scale. And that's when the first weakness became clear. Because even when the United States had access to raw materials, it still relied on one critical step happening somewhere else. A step it didn't fully control. Which meant control didn't depend on ownership. It depended on access. And access can be restricted, but at the exact moment which matters the most. This is where the discovery deepened. Because rare earths weren't the real weakness. They were just the signal, the first indication that something larger was happening underneath. Because once China started looking, that same pattern kept appearing. And this is where it became impossible to ignore. The real pattern was in manufacturing. Over time, production of critical components moved across the world. Not as a strategy, but as a habit repeated over decades. Each decision made sense on its own. But together, they built something else. And China noticed what most didn't. The system wasn't just global. It was concentrated, because many of those supply chains quietly ran through the same place. The same factories, regions, infrastructure. And that changed the equation completely. What once looked like efficiency started to look like dependence. And that's when the weakness stopped being theoretical. Because those same supply chains didn't just support industries. They supported defense. Modern military systems rely on advanced electronics, precision manufacturing, and specialized components. All of it connected to global production networks. And China saw the next layer. Not just where things were made, but how fast they could be replaced. Because in modern conflict scenarios, systems are used faster than they can be rebuilt. Missiles, components, advanced systems, used in days, replaced in months. And that gap matters. Because now the question isn't just capability, it's recovery. How fast can you rebuild what you lose? And more importantly, who do you rely on to rebuild it? But the pattern didn't stop there. Because the next discovery was even something bigger: energy. As the world began shifting toward green technology, a new supply chain started forming. Batteries, solar panels, electric vehicles. And once again, China paid attention to where the critical steps were happening. Not just production, but refinement. The materials behind the technology. And this is where the pattern became impossible to ignore. Because the future of energy, just like manufacturing, was becoming centralized. Which meant the next generation of infrastructure was being built on the same kind of dependence. Just in a different form. But the final piece wasn't industrial. It was strategic. Because while these dependencies were forming, the United States was focused everywhere at once. Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, military, economic, diplomatic. At first, that looks like strength, global reach, global influence. But this is where it starts to shift. Because China noticed that their attention wasn't concentrated. It was divided. The resources weren't unlimited. They were stretched. And priorities weren't aligned. They were competing. Which created a different kind of weakness. Not a lack of power, but a limit to how that power could be used at the same time. And this is where everything connects. Because what China found wasn't a single flaw. It was a system. Supply chains linked to manufacturing. Manufacturing linked to defense. Defense linked to energy. Each layer depends on the one before it. All of it built slowly. All of it optimized for efficiency, not resilience. And that trade-off is easy to ignore until it isn't. However, nothing looks broken on its own. But when you step back, the pattern becomes impossible to miss. So when people ask how China found America's weakness, it wasn't through one discovery. It was through observation. That was done step by step, layer by layer. decision by decision, until what looked like strength started to reveal something else. Because in the end, the weakness wasn't in power, it was in reliance. And once that reliance becomes visible, it doesn't just change how systems work, it changes how power itself works.